The call came on a Tuesday, which is a strange thing to remember, but I do. I was standing in my kitchen in Guelph, still in my coat, keys in my hand, groceries melting on the counter, and my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. A 519 area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. The woman on the other end introduced herself as a care coordinator at Riverside Glen. She said she was calling about a resident named Hugh Beaumont. That she'd found my name listed as an emergency contact on a form dated almost 4 years ago. She paused after that, like she was waiting to see if I'd hang up. I didn't hang up. Hugh Beaumont is my ex-husband's father. I should say, my ex-husband's father in the sense that I haven't been married to his son for 3 years now. The divorce was quiet, the way divorces are when both people are just too tired to fight. I'd packed 2 boxes and driven myself back to Guelph, and I told myself that chapter was closed. I believed it, mostly. But when she said his name, something shifted. She told me Hugh had been admitted 8 months ago, that he'd been listed as a self-pay resident when he arrived, which I didn't fully understand at the time. She said his son, my ex-husband, Kieran, had handled all the initial paperwork. She said he and his girlfriend had visited twice in the first month and not once since. Then she said something that made me set my keys down on the counter. She said Hugh had been asking for me. I drove out the next afternoon. Riverside Glen sits just off Stone Road, one of those newer facilities that looks cheerful from the outside. Big windows, a garden entrance, a sign with a maple leaf on it. Inside, it smelled like floor cleaner and cafeteria soup, and something else underneath that I couldn't name. A kind of stillness that wasn't peaceful. The hallways were long and quiet in the way places get quiet when people stop expecting visitors. His room was at the end of the east wing. The door was half open. I stood in the hallway for longer than I should have, looking at the name printed on the little card in the door bracket. Hugh Beaumont. His handwriting had been neat and slanted. To the right, I remembered that. He used to leave notes on the kitchen counter when I'd stayed over in those early years. Before everything, little grocery lists. Reminders, always with that tidy, careful slant. I knocked and pushed the door open. He was sitting in a chair by the window, facing the parking lot. He was wearing a gray cardigan I didn't recognize, and his hair was thinner than I remembered and whiter. He didn't turn around right away. "Hugh?" I said. He turned slowly, and for a second I saw confusion move across his face like a cloud crossing water. Then it cleared. He said my name the way someone says a word they thought they'd forgotten how to pronounce. "Nora," he said. "That's me." I walked in and pulled up the chair near his bed. The room was clean but bare. No photos on the windowsill, no cards taped to the wall, no plant, nothing. Just a small TV mounted near the ceiling and a plastic cup of apple juice on the side table. We talked for about 40 minutes that first visit, or I talked, mostly. He drifted in and out of it. Some of what he said made sense, and some of it didn't. And I learned quickly that the best thing to do was just follow him, not correct him. He thought I was still married to Kieran for part of it. He asked if we'd eaten yet. He called me by the wrong name once. Someone named Patricia, and then caught himself and looked embarrassed, and I told him not to worry. When I stood up to leave, he reached out and grabbed my wrist. Not hard, but firm. "Come back," he said. It wasn't a question. I came back the following week. And the week after that, I started bringing things. Tim Hortons, because he'd always liked their steeped tea, or a slice of butter tart from the bakery on Woolwich if I had time. He didn't always eat what I brought, but he always seemed to like that I brought it. We developed a rhythm. I'd arrive around 2, after the lunch trays had been cleared. We'd sit by the window. Some days he was sharp and articulate, and we'd talk about things he remembered, his years working in municipal planning in Waterloo, a fishing trip he'd taken with his brother in the 80s, the house he'd owned in Elmira before he sold it. Other days he barely spoke and just seemed relieved to have someone sit with him. The staff started recognizing me. One of the PSWs, A woman named Denise, who always wore her hair in two braids and had the most efficient walk I'd ever seen, told me one afternoon that I was his only regular visitor. I knew that already, but hearing her say it out loud felt different. I didn't call Kieran. I thought about it. I picked up my phone a dozen times in those first weeks. We weren't on bad terms exactly. We just weren't on any terms. The divorce had dissolved everything between us, including the obligation to keep each other informed. But his father was here, in a care home 30 minutes from where we'd lived together, and he wasn't visiting. Busy, I kept telling myself that word. Maybe he was busy. People get busy. About 6 weeks in, Hugh had a clear day. Exceptionally clear. I arrived to find him already sitting upright in his chair, dressed, hair combed, looking more like himself than he had since I'd started coming. He said good afternoon when I walked in. He asked how the drive was. We talked for a while about nothing important, and then he turned to the window and said, quietly, almost to himself, "I should have been nicer to you." I looked at him. He was still looking at the parking lot. "When you were married to him," he said, "I wasn't always kind to you. I thought you weren't." He stopped, chose a different word. "I thought you weren't right for him." I was wrong. I didn't know what to say, so I said the only honest thing I could think of. "You were never cruel," I told him, "just careful." He nodded slowly, like that was enough. Maybe it was. Then he said, "He put me here on purpose." I went still. He turned and looked at me properly then, not confused, not drifting. Completely present. "Kieran, he put me here because I wouldn't do something he asked me to do. He's been trying to get me to sign papers since before your divorce. I wouldn't, so he arranged this. He said it was for my health. He had a doctor he knew, he set it all up, and then he stopped coming." I sat very carefully back in my chair. "What kind of papers?" I asked. He sighed. "Complicated things. The property in Elmira, the investments I still have. He wants control of everything while I'm—" He waved his hand. "While I'm like this. While I can't fight back properly." His eyes stayed steady on mine as he said it. I knew what he was describing. I just didn't want to say the words first. A few days later I came early, mid-morning. I'd barely slept, and I'd spent 2 evenings on the phone with a friend who works in elder law in Kitchener, asking careful, hypothetical-sounding questions. What she told me made my hands cold. When I got to Hugh's room, the door was open wider than usual. I heard voices before I saw anyone. 2 voices. I recognized the first one immediately. Kieran. I hadn't heard his voice in almost 3 years, but it landed on me the same way it always had. That low, measured tone he used when he was managing a situation. He thought of conversations as situations to be managed. I stood just to the side of the door, in the hallway, and I listened. "Just put your initials there," he was saying. "And your signature at the bottom. That's all." "I don't understand what I'm signing," Hugh said. "You don't need to understand the details. That's what the lawyers handle. You trust me, right?" Silence. A woman's voice then, sharper, with an impatient exhale threaded through it. "Kieran's girlfriend." I'd never met her, but I knew her name was Britt from things mutual friends had mentioned. "Hugh," she said, "it's just paperwork. It protects the family. You want to protect the family, don't you?" I pushed the door open. They both turned. Kieran's face did something complicated in the first half-second, surprise, then a calculation, then an expression that was almost a smile, but not quite. "Nora," he said. "What are you doing here?" "Visiting," I said. I walked all the way into the room and stood near the foot of Hugh's bed, looking at the papers in Kieran's hand. I couldn't read them from where I was, but I could see there were several pages and that there were sticky tabs on the signature lines. "You've been coming here?" His tone was careful, neutral. He was trying to figure out what I knew. "Every week," I said. "For almost 2 months." Hugh looked at me with something in his eyes I couldn't quite read. Gratitude, maybe. Or relief. Kieran took a breath. "This is a family matter," he said. "I understand that. Then you understand it doesn't involve you." I looked at the papers. "Those need to be explained to him properly," I said. "By someone independent." Not by you in his room I gestured at Hugh, while he doesn't have representation. Britt made a sound, short and dismissive. Kieran, she said, we don't have time for this. Kieran stepped toward me slightly. He wasn't threatening, not exactly, but there was something in the movement that was meant to establish something. We're his family, Nora. You're his ex-daughter-in-law. You have no standing here. I kept my voice even. That might be true legally, but if he signed something under conditions that could be construed as pressure or coercion, that's a different conversation. He laughed once, without warmth. You're going to lecture me about elder law? No, I said. I'm going to make sure he has the chance to talk to someone who can. Hugh spoke then. He'd been watching us with that still, watchful expression he sometimes had on his good days. I won't sign today, he said clearly. I want to think about it. Kieran looked at him. Dad, I said I won't sign today. The room was quiet. Britt gathered her coat. Kieran held the papers for a moment longer, and I had the strange sensation of watching him decide something. Then he put them in his bag. He looked at me on his way out. You're making this complicated, he said. It was already complicated, I said. I just showed up. The door closed behind them. Hugh and I sat together for a long time after that. He didn't say much, and neither did I. Outside, the afternoon had gone gray, the way it does in Guelph in October, that flat pewter sky that means the real cold is coming. I watched the last of the parking lot light fade. When I got home, I didn't sleep again. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I forgot to drink, and I thought about what Kieran was doing. Not what I suspected, what I knew. What I knew. And then I opened my laptop and I sent an email to my friend in Kitchener. Not hypothetical this time. Specific. She called me the next morning. What I learned over the next 2 days was worse than I'd expected. Not because the law was unclear. It wasn't. But because Kieran had been methodical. He'd had Hugh's GP, a doctor he'd been referred to through a friend, not the family doctor Hugh had had for 30 years. Complete a capacity assessment 8 months ago. The assessment had concluded Hugh had diminished capacity in certain financial matters. That assessment was the cornerstone of what Kieran was trying to build. He hadn't gotten power of attorney yet. That was what the papers were. He was trying to get a full, durable financial power of attorney, which would give him control over everything. The property in Elmira. The RRSP accounts. The house Hugh had been renting out since he'd moved in with my ex-husband years before the divorce, and Hugh had refused to sign, which was why he was here. I drove back to Riverside Glen the following afternoon, but this time I wasn't alone. I came with my friend from Kitchener. She'd agreed to come in person, as an independent legal advisor, not formally retained by anyone yet. Just present to make sure Hugh understood his rights and his options. She was small and quiet and wore glasses and had a way of speaking that was very slow and very precise, that I'd learned over the years meant she was paying complete attention. She'd done this before. She'd seen this before. We met with Hugh together. My friend explained who she was. She explained what power of attorney meant. She explained what a capacity assessment was, and that he had the right to request an independent one, from a clinician of his choosing. She told him that no document needed to be signed without full understanding and without independent review. She said it all carefully and plainly, and Hugh listened with his hands folded in his lap. When she was done, he nodded once. How do I get an independent assessment? He asked. She told him. She gave him a name, a process, a timeline. She told him it could be done right here, at the facility, by a geriatric psychiatrist from Grand River Hospital who specialized in exactly this. She said she'd make the referral. Then she stepped outside to make a phone call, and it was just Hugh and me. He looked at me for a moment with that clear expression he had on his good days. You didn't have to do this, he said. I know. I've been difficult, he said, in the past. You've been human, I said. He smiled a little at that. Not his old smile, that one had been wide and a bit proud. This one was small and tired and somehow more real. Kieran came back 3 days later. I found out from Denise, who mentioned it in passing when I arrived for my usual visit. She said he'd come in the morning, alone this time, and that Hugh had asked him to leave. That the conversation hadn't been long. When I got to Hugh's room that day, he was sitting up in bed, looking like he'd just done something hard. Which I supposed he had. He came back, I said. He did. What happened? He finally said something I'd needed to hear him say for a long time, Hugh said. He looked out the window. He told me that what I was doing. He gestured in my direction, meaning all of this, the visits, the lawyer. He told me it was embarrassing, that I was embarrassing the family. He said I was letting an ex-daughter-in-law make decisions for me, and that it made him look bad. He paused, and that was when I knew, he said quietly. Because a son worried about his father doesn't say that. A son worried about himself says that. I didn't say anything. I just sat with him. What happened next took several weeks, and it wasn't dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no single confrontation, no moment where everything crashed down. What happened was quieter than that, and more permanent. The independent capacity assessment happened. The geriatric psychiatrist from Grand River came in on a Wednesday and spent 90 minutes with Hugh. Her report concluded that Hugh Beaumont had fluctuating but present capacity for financial decision-making, particularly on his good days, and that any document signed during a clear period of demonstrated capacity with independent witnesses would be legally valid. Kieran's capacity assessment, the one his friend's doctor had completed 8 months ago, was formally challenged. My friend in Kitchener filed the challenge on Hugh's behalf. The facility flagged the file. The public guardian and trustee's office was notified, which is a step in Ontario that nobody wants to trigger on the wrong side of. Because once they're involved, they look at everything. I don't know exactly what Kieran was told or when. I only know that the papers stopped coming. The visits, what few there had been, stopped entirely. And for a while I kept waiting for something to happen, for Kieran to do something, to push back harder, to retaliate in some way. He didn't. Or, at least not directly. What he did instead was show up at my door on a Saturday morning in November. I opened it and he was standing on my porch in a jacket that wasn't warm enough for the weather we were having. Which I noticed because he'd always been careless about the cold. And it struck me suddenly how much I didn't miss knowing those kinds of details about a person. He didn't say hello. He said, "You humiliated me." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about what Hugh had said. A son worried about himself. "You had your father sitting in a care home for 8 months, I said. You put him there, and you didn't go back. You spent that time trying to get legal control of his assets. And you're at my door to tell me I humiliated you." He didn't say anything. "I think you should go," I said. He left. I closed the door. The following week I drove out to Riverside Glen on a Tuesday afternoon, which had become my usual day. Denise was at the desk and she told me Hugh was already awake and had asked if I was coming. I said yes and walked down the East Hall. He was standing when I came in, which was new. He'd been doing more of that lately. The physiotherapist had started coming twice a week, and Hugh had apparently decided he wasn't going to let his legs forget what they were for. He was standing by the window with his hands on the back of his chair, looking at the garden outside. He heard me come in and turned around carefully. He looked steadier than he had in months. "I have something for you," he said. He moved to the small table beside his bed and picked up an envelope. It was sealed. My name was written on the front in that tidy right slanting handwriting I remembered. He'd addressed it by hand. "I did this a few weeks ago," he said, "on one of my better mornings, with the notary your friend arranged. I wanted to make sure it was done properly." I took the envelope. My hands weren't entirely steady. "Open it later," he said. "When you're home." I did. I sat at my kitchen table that evening with the envelope in front of me, and a cup of tea I actually drank this time. Outside, the street was quiet, the way Guelph gets quiet in mid-November when the leaves are down and the snow hasn't come yet and everything feels temporarily held. I opened it. Inside was a letter, 4 pages in his handwriting, and a document. The document was a formal declaration, notarized and witnessed, explaining that I, Nora Ashford, had acted as a voluntary advocate for Hugh Beaumont during a period of vulnerability, and that in recognition of that, and in the exercise of his full legal capacity, he had made a specific bequest in his updated will. Not everything. He wasn't trying to reward me, he said in the letter. He was trying to do the right thing. He left me the Elmira property, not because it was worth the most, though it was worth something, but because he'd once heard me say, years ago at a dinner I'd half forgotten, that I'd always wanted a house with a big porch and old trees. He'd remembered that. The letter was 4 pages long and I read it twice. He wrote about his own failures as a father, clearly, and without flinching. He wrote about watching Kieran become someone he didn't recognize and not knowing when that had started. He wrote about being afraid, in that nursing home, in a way he'd never been afraid of anything in his working life. And then he wrote about the afternoon I'd pushed the door open and stood in the room and said quietly that Hugh deserved to understand what he was signing. You walked in like, you had every right to be there, he wrote. I want you to know you did. I set the letter down and looked out the window for a while. I still drive out to Riverside Glen every Tuesday. The care coordinator who called me in September always says hello when she sees me in the lobby. Denise is usually at the desk by the time I get to the East Wing. Hugh has good days and harder days, the way people do when they're 81 and living with what he's living with. But on the good days, we sit by the window and drink tea and talk about small things. And sometimes he asks about my week, and sometimes I tell him about the house in Elmira, the one I'm slowly figuring out what to do with. There's a big porch, I told him last week, and the trees are enormous. He smiled, the real one this time, wide and a bit proud. I knew you'd like it, he said.